I don't know if you ever find this recording, but like whenever I begin a recording, that's when most of the lag will hit. And then within
Right.
it kind of clears up. I have no idea how any of this technology works. Like, well, okay, now there's no lag. Cool.
Yeah, especially I still use Zoom for a lot of things, and it's
Yeah, yeah.
amazing how counterintuitive and like non-functional a lot of it is. I don't know. It's very very strange,
Yeah,
especially
I
because
just
like
like this
governments are using
because
it and stuff.
I know I just like this platform because I pay a little bit for it, but it gives me control over the design. And I'm very
Yeah,
particular about like how I want things to look and like cropped and all that.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
So
Zoom is a little bit. It's a little difficult on the user, but
it
yeah.
is.
I should probably switch to StreamYard actually, to be honest. But
Streamer is pretty good, but you know, to each their own. Well, tell me about yourself. I don't know much about you, but I saw you have a pretty decently sized YouTube channel focusing on Nietzsche and related topics, and I thought that was really cool. So, like, what got you into YouTubing? Who are you? What's your story?
yeah, so I am a musician. I'm a touring musician.
Hmm.
I guess the term a lot of people have used is autodidact because I did go to college, but I dropped out. Most of my learning was spent on the road. Was while we were doing these 7 8 hour drives,
Hmm.
reading. I'd be reading philosophy books, and then had a couple of other band members who were also into philosophy, and we would trade. And so I ended up reading a lot of things I would never normally read because it was like in their interest and kind of expanding my horizons.
Hmm.
And the Nietzsche podcast started during COVID. That was when basically all the touring and the live shows slowed down or it stopped entirely, and I was just sort of in the house. And I was a part of some Nietzsche book clubs online. I had written a lot of articles for the subreddit wiki for Nietzsche, and I had had many people suggest to me not only tell me that I had a good voice, but also that I explained things really well. And I decided to try my hand at it, and that was about almost 4 years ago now.
Okay.
Of trying to basically stay consistent with it and put out an episode every week. Sometimes these the podcast got a little out of hand with originally planning on doing like 45 minutes to an hour. Now I'm doing these sprawling like 2.5 hour podcasts sometimes. But what I try to do is stick very closely to the text and
Hmm.
to
Hmm.
um, I, a lot of the time I find with philosophy channels, they just kind of tell you what someone thought without telling you why they thought that,
Hmm.
without getting you into their head and into their perspective. And that's what I try and do more than anything is because I talk about philosophers other than Nietzsche at this point, sort of starting from Nietzsche and then branching out. I realized
Sure.
you could go in many different directions because he's influenced by so many important philosophers, but also pretty much every philosopher 20th century and beyond is influenced by Nietzsche at this point. And so, no matter who I'm talking about, I try to at least get the audience to, I try to give them the steelman position
Hmm.
and try and, at least for my purposes, see the world through their eyes for the time being for that episode. Even if I totally disagree with them, I've done uh, some religious philosophy recently, like Kierkegaard and Pascal. It's very foreign to my worldview, but I really like getting into someone's head. And I especially like getting into ideas where somebody just sees the world in a totally different way from the normal modern perspective, or even from my own. So that's sort of the mission statement of the podcast, I guess.
Well, I think that's an excellent mission statement. It's easy to critique somebody, but it is hard to give them their due and actually try to understand where they're coming from. That's hard to do.
Yeah, and it's also, Nietzsche said famously that whenever he attacked a philosopher, it was because that was like him paying them an honor or a
Mm.
respect. And one of the most interesting things about Nietzsche is that, like he attacks Socrates. Socrates is the patron saint of philosophy in some ways. That even people who critique Socrates generally tend to afford him a lot of reverence. And Nietzsche's attack is just totally radical and in some ways offensive.
Right.
But it's to me, if you like really love Socrates and the Platonic dialogues, it's kind of boring after a while if everyone's just sort of praising it. It's like it
Right.
takes somebody seriously when you attack them. So even when I'm covering critiques of philosophers, it's usually where there's something that like brings something out about that philosopher that's not seen before, with just sort of, there's something about engaging with the ideas in a critical way that's like taking it more seriously in a
Yes.
sense. So I think that's
Well,
really useful too.
it's like there's only so much time in a day and in a lifetime. And so if I think that someone's position is just obviously false or the arguments they give are silly, sophomoric, unsophisticated, I'm not going to spend time either writing a journal article to critique it, making a YouTube video to interact with it, or bring them onto the channel to discuss with them. So I get that. It's like if I'm interacting with something, it's because I think that even if I disagree with the conclusion, it's sophisticated. It's good stuff. And I think it's worth my time to figure out why I disagree with it, where they're coming from, and to see if I can respond to it. So I think that's right. It's like you're not going to spend time on positions you perceive to be totally worthless.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that was a large part of why. I mean, I guess if the viewers are unaware of kind of how this
Yeah, tell
we
us.
reached
How
out
did
to
we
each
get
other
here?
was, yeah, I saw a video of you interviewing Michael Huemer,
Yes.
and I completely disagreed with his argument, but I thought it was really fascinating. It was a kind of argument for free will that I had not seen before. In some ways reminded me of like the ontological argument,
Mm,
strangely enough, because it's like trying to start from pure deduction and arrive at a sort of like a claim about reality that is usually treated as something that you can't just deduce from, starting from premise one, premise two, premise three.
right.
And his argument, it was very novel to me, and so I ended up I intended to just write a brief comment about my disagreement with him, which I don't normally do on YouTube videos either. But also, as I started to write it, I found I had to like revise the comment. I ended up writing this paragraphs long thing, and I realized that his argument was a lot more. It was a lot more sophisticated than I initially thought, and
Mm.
nevertheless, I still disagree with it. And I still there were, but I guess, yeah. Just to get back to kind of the point we were making before, I admire his argument in many ways. I liked many things about it, and so yeah.
Yeah, I like Michael Huemer a lot. I'll say at the outset. I think he's a brilliant philosopher. I think that he embodies for me like what philosophy really is about. Like in a perfect world, in an ideal world, you'd be able to discover the truth in the papers and the arguments that you make. But I think far more often and realistically speaking, we're just trying to push the dialectic forward, like push the
Mm.
argument forward. And so I think of my like contributions as like they're the best I can do at the time. But do I think that ultimately they will prove correct and true and final? Maybe not. But like it pushes the investigation forward. And so I like his more radical positions, not necessarily because I think they're right, but because they're sophisticated and they make you think. And in the effort to respond to them and say we ultimately find out, oh, the argument is fallacious, it's wrong, but you learn something significant and it makes progress. And so I like that he can kind of blaze a trail forward, even when it's just him arguing for that position. He's like, bah,
Yeah,
no one really thinks this, but I think it's obvious. I like that. I like that attitude.
yeah, absolutely. And I think what he was pointing to, um, on if I because he strikes me as a more analytical
Yeah, yeah,
school type of
definitely.
person. So if I might phrase it in a way that is very continental and sort of speaks to the intuition of what I took as valuable in what he was saying, is that he was really drawing a link between moral responsibility in some sense, or a
Yes.
moral duty, and the belief in libertarian free will. And that what's underneath his argument is sort of the idea that determinists really can't make the argument that they kind of lose the ability to invoke moral duties or responsibilities, at least in some sense.
Yes.
And if you include among that the duty to hold beliefs that are true, then they kind of lose the ability to critique the libertarian free will argument. And I think that in many senses is true, that you
Mm.
do actually lose the sense of moral responsibility as a determinist. So I thought that was very interesting that he brings that out.
Yes. Yes. So I want to get into the nitty-gritty of his argument, but for me, I'm gonna what we're here to do today is to look at the
Mm,
intersection between Nietzsche and free will and Michael Huemer's argument specifically, to the extent that we can
mm,
make meaningful connections. The trouble for me is that I am an analytic philosopher through and through,
mm.
and it's merely because every time I've turned to continental philosophy, which has not been very many times, I will admit, I can't make heads or tails of it. It is not the way that my brain works. And I even in my master's program, we had some latitude in the focuses that we could choose and in the topics that we could choose. And for one of my units, I chose Kierkegaard and Schleiermacher.
Mm.
And that was the toughest month of my life. I
Wow.
I mean, really, like my tutors and the professors that I had, most of them liked me a great deal. But my Schleiermacher and Kierkegaard tutors didn't care for me because I just couldn't understand their writings. And I'm not so arrogant as to think that that means, therefore, they make no sense at all. It's more that I recognize there's a deficiency here because there are plenty of brilliant people who find continental philosophy illuminating. I just understand that I am missing something. So I think it'll be interesting for us to talk today to see what common ground we can find. And if you can help me understand Nietzsche, who I think falls in the continental camp. But that was
Yeah.
going to be my first question for you is at the biggest picture here, we have this kind of obscure distinction between analytic philosophy, continental philosophy. Where does Nietzsche fall as a thinker?
Definitely on the continental side, though, the complication is that many people see Nietzsche as almost, I mean, this is sort of presumptuous, right? I mean, everyone's always making this claim that they're closing off or completing a system or ending an era or it's
Mm,
beginning a new era, commencing one. But I think with Nietzsche, it's somewhat justified that in a very important sense, he does, even if you don't see him as like strictly speaking the end of continental enlightenment philosophy, he marks at least something significant in its development that signals that the project is coming to an end. And I
mm,
think that he doesn't get enough credit for his Nietzsche's critiques of language that you can see as the anticipation of Wittgenstein in
mm,
many ways. I don't think that Wittgenstein was actually necessarily influenced by Nietzsche, but they made some strikingly similar points. And then the other developments you get in the 20th century are bringing psychoanalysis into philosophy
mm,
and sort of the critique of the perspective of the one arguing the point that becomes very important in postmodernism and critical theory. Um, but in addition to this, just psychoanalysis in general. I mean, Freud read Nietzsche and was very influenced by him,
mm.
as was Jung. They both reject him in important ways. Freud even tried to sort of dishonestly somewhat suggest that he didn't read Nietzsche to the extent that he had, which is kind of amusing because he quotes from him liberally in his first work and then later suggested he hadn't read much Nietzsche. But so you have those threads. And then, of course, there's existentialism. I mean, you brought up Kierkegaard.
Right.
Nietzsche and Kierkegaard are seen as like the proto existentialists in many ways. And so those are all very modern or postmodern movements in philosophy that don't necessarily intersect with the analytic tradition. I mean, Wittgenstein certainly does.
Right.
But I think Nietzsche does represent sort of a closing of a chapter, at least in philosophy, that opens up these new conceptions of what philosophy is,
Mm,
where throughout the Enlightenment, throughout the continental tradition, with both empiricism and rationalism, there's this attempt to get at the objective truth or something like that. And with Kant's critique of reason, trying to understand what it is that that reason actually can know. To what extent can it even uh, give us a picture of the true world, the thing in itself, or is it just
right.
statements about the phenomenal world? And with Nietzsche, I think that's where we finally get into a really serious critique that many of these statements might actually be, uh, what might we say, like with Wittgenstein, that much of our statements about the world are really they're statements that are patterned by structured by language that thought itself might
Mm,
actually be structured by. It's not as if like thought is something free floating and in flux and then we just put it into a linguistic box. That even by the time you have a thought, it's already been patterned by word concepts, and that there's something collective about this process, that there's no private languages. And so too with the postmodernists, with the analysis of the text, the deconstruction of meta narratives. So too with the psychoanalysis, kind of going, consider the source of the idea. I don't know if I can give you a single term or a single phrase to describe what's going on there, but it's something that it's definitely a very different type of question from using reason to get to the objective truth. We're
Yes.
interrogating the process a lot more post Nietzsche, I think.
I think that's right. I think that helps to illuminate the distinction in general between analytic and continental thought. To the degree that I understand continental thought, it it, it focuses a lot more on, well, first, one major difference is the style of exposition of like how they do philosophy in the written medium anyway. Like in continental philosophy, you you begin reading it and you realize that like it's far more narrative in structure than is like an analytic work in philosophy of mind or philosophy of science. It's often like reading a story, and
Yeah.
the premises and the conclusion are not always explicitly delineated or stated. And as someone who just kind of grew up in the analytic tradition and is very used to that, it can be kind of jarring to
Mm.
read this and go, whoa, 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 when are you going to make the argument? Like, what's happening? Why is there this story going on? All this description. It seems extraneous, but it's obviously not. It's just a different way of doing it. But it can be very hard for like me to make sense of it, because all I want to say to them is like, but just tell me what you're trying to say.
Mm.
But it seems that often in continental thought, it's almost not as important to them to make it extremely clear what they're trying to say. Now, maybe that's not right, but often, like when I read Schleiermacher, it was like the sense that they want you to put in the work to try and distill the
Mm.
meaning. Whereas in analytic thought, it's like the prized virtue is clarity. And now when you say it like that, maybe that's uncharitable, but I don't know. Maybe you can help me understand continental philosophy better in that way.
I think that's somewhat correct. I mean, so Heidegger is a great example of a continental philosopher who comes
Mm.
after Nietzsche. So clearly, Nietzsche didn't totally end the project. But, Heidegger spends 400 pages in Being and Time preparing the question,
Yeah.
you know? So he's not even really concerned with getting to the end. And I think that's because, like, as you say, he actually wants, like, I think his goal is for his readers to do the thinking.
Right.
And so he's really trying to begin from the beginning without any presuppositions at all. No groundwork laid. Like, I have to start from an original philosophy. And so I think there is a lot of that in continental philosophy where they are trying to, it's like, it's about the journey, perhaps, rather than the destination, to be too much of a hippie about it.
Right.
But, Nietzsche writes, you're talking about it's more narrative. Nietzsche writes a novel, Thus Spoke Zarathustra,
Right.
or
Right.
parts of it are in the style of the New Testament and the Sermon on the Mount, replicating that. So he's using religious language, he's using metaphors and sort of opaque allegories at times. And so that's why I think Nietzsche is a very interesting philosopher to consider as regards this question, because he's very firmly, in terms of his style, he's absolutely a continental philosopher. You
Yes.
wouldn't put him in the category of like a Russell or anyone like that.
Right. Right.
And yet he has, it's almost like he's trying to close the book on that chapter, and he kind of summons this new era where we again do begin asking the more hermeneutical questions, asking the questions about the process, asking questions about thinking, right? That so many philosophers had left that aside. The taking it for, I mean, that's where we get the beginning of continental philosophy, is Descartes, I think therefore I am. And Nietzsche has a wonderful section in Beyond Good and Evil when he says that that's not an immediate certainty. That when he analyzes the statement, even I think, that he finds a whole series of daring assertions, the argumentative proof of which would be difficult, if not impossible. And so, is Nietzsche doing philosophy in the style of like philosophy of cognitive neuroscience and stuff today? Absolutely not. But I think in a very important way, he sort of opens up the door to philosophy of that style, which is, it's very interesting. And I have talked to a couple of analytical philosophers who say that distinction is starting to break down more and more. actually, I don't know if you're familiar with Paul Katsafanis, but he's an analytical philosopher who is a Nietzschean constitutivist. So he like makes he advances these analytical style arguments, but like using Nietzsche as a jumping off point. Basically saying his theory is that in the same way that Kant said that um, the categorical imperative, it kind of, you argue for it by arguing that rationality or making a freely determined rational choice is constitutive of human action. His argument is Nietzsche advances the same position, except that instead of rationality, it's will to power is constitutive of action, meaning that what constitutes any action is power or capability or something like that. And so, and I don't necessarily want to get into like going into breaking down his whole framework, but just pointing out it is interesting that there have been in recent years some analytical philosophers who are using continental material and putting it into the analytical language.
And I would be fascinated to look at that. That might be my avenue into continental philosophy, is beginning with like a translation of it and then working into like the primary material. So then I'd be like,
Yeah,
okay,
translation
kind
is
of.
a funny term for it.
Well,
Yeah.
honestly, and you're going to miss something, right? Like it is in fact a different way of doing philosophy. And if you try to reduce it to or translate it into analytic talk, you're going to leave out vital components, but it might be a beginning for someone like me.
Mhm.
And so, yeah, after that unit in my master's degree, I shelved continental philosophy for the time being, put it back on the shelf, and I said, I will come back to this one day, because I'm still not willing to just write it all off. Like it can't be the case that it's all just opaque nonsense. It's not. Even if I can't make sense of it, that reveals a limitation in me. And so one day I will. But specifically with Nietzsche, we're looking at his views on free will. And I think before looking at Michael Huemer's argument, it would be good to get situated on what Nietzsche's views are on free will in general. I
Mhm.
did some reading about it in the secondary literature anyway, and there I think with a lot of Nietzsche's views, there's some interpretive disagreement about what he thinks specifically
Mhm.
and how he might map onto like analytic distinctions between hard determinists, compatibilists, libertarians. So, what are Nietzsche's views on free will?
Yeah. So, uh, how to approach this? The first thing I'll say is that there are a couple of different phases in Nietzsche's thought where his
Mm,
views change somewhat. There are similarities, but there are important differences. And also, Nietzsche is responding to a tradition of thinkers, really going back to Schopenhauer and then through Schopenhauer, Spinoza, which, by the way, Spinoza, just as an aside, is, I think, yeah, I mean, he would be considered a continental philosopher, but if
mm,
you're an analytical philosopher, that's the one to read, because he I mean, he ends his statements with QED. As has been demonstrated, he considered his philosophy like a geometrical proof, basically.
right.
So he's very mathematical and very straightforward with his arguments, unlike many continental philosophers. So in any case, Nietzsche, he never is a free will libertarian. When he first starts writing about free will, you could, at least superficially speaking, at least at a glance, put him in the determinist camp. And this coincides with what you would call the middle period, where Nietzsche's somewhat of a positivist. He is very attuned to the, what would we say, the research in that was available at the time in the 1800s,
Mm,
and was very much, Nietzsche gets often conflated as being some sort of a rationalist romantic, and he certainly has those streaks to him, but he's actually very concerned with science and with conforming his views to the newest findings in science. He follows occasionally some figures that now aren't really considered to have been correct in retrospect, but there is a scientific element to it. There is a positivistic element to what Nietzsche is doing during this time. In his writings, particularly in Human All Too Human, tend to emphasize many deterministic arguments that might be very familiar to many of your viewers. That there's a passage called "At the Waterfall," where he says, if we look at a waterfall, there's all these movements of the water, sort of spilling and dancing and leaping. all these water droplets, that it seems like it's totally random or chaotic. But if we could calculate, if you had some sort of basis to calculate every last, atomic movement of the water, you would be able to predict exactly how it was going to move,
Mm.
based on what we know about physics. And that the same thing is true of human beings. He makes the analogy to human beings that uh, the fact that human beings sometimes act in ways that are unpredictable, or where their motives or intentions might even be unknown to themselves at certain times, doesn't mean that we couldn't calculate it if we had enough information or something like that. And I have heard modern day determinists make that very same argument. That,
Yes.
oh, sorry if you were going to interject something.
Oh, all I was going to say is I realized I should have laid part of the conceptual groundwork in that for those who don't have the philosophical background, determinism, and you can help me flesh out the definition, but it's my understanding that determinism would be the view that everything that happens in the world is necessitated to happen by the conditions that it obtain in the past. So given the state of the universe at a time t and the laws of nature that are operative at that time, the state of the universe at any time later than t is determined, is
Mm-hmm.
necessitated. There's no forking off point at any point in the history of the universe where two possible futures are genuinely open. Rather, there's only one. Everything that happens is necessitated, is determined by prior conditions. And so the thought is, for many people, is that that rules out freedom of the will, because that means the choice that we make had to be that way. And not everybody agrees with that. So that's basically determinism, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and I think it's helpful to look at how people tend to define libertarian free will, or one of the easiest ways of defining it is that it's the belief that with any given action, you could have done otherwise than you actually did. So, sort of retrospectively looking back at your actions, you, if you were to repeat that same decision point, you could have arbitrarily, just according to your will, decided to do something differently. The reason why, from like a positivistic standpoint, this is problematic is that it sort of makes the human will acausal. Or, like, if we're assuming that for example, like the movements of stars and the orbits of the planets, that every movement that they make is predetermined by all of these past causes of, the mass of the objects and the constants that are obtained over the heavenly bodies, as they would have said in the old days, as they whirl around the heavens. um, there's no point at which Pluto can decide, I'm going to go in reverse now, right? And so it's only with human beings. It's often not even with animals that we make the leap that they have free will, at least in the sense that, and this is an argument that I believe Sam Harris has used in the past, or an example he's brought up, that there was an elephant named, I forget her name. It might have been Lucy. There's an elephant, a circus elephant, that rampaged in, I believe, the 1920s, sometime shortly after the turn of the century, that killed several people, and the townspeople got together and like lynched the elephant. It's actually rather absurd. They kind of like hoisted it from a crane, as like an example to the other elephants. And what the reason why Harris brings this up is that from our perspective today, most people look at that and intuitively say this just speaks to some sort of like moral confusion, like that action. And so the argument would be that even as regards to most animals, like, we're not going to say that a tiger had the ability not to, gobble somebody up that he happens upon in the jungle, that he had the ability to act otherwise and therefore shouldn't have done so. It's typically only with human beings that we make that determination. Now, that doesn't mean that that's not possible, that we are rational agents in some fashion that no other being is. But it would mean it already sort of puts the free will libertarian on the back foot, insofar as you do have to make the argument that there's something fundamentally different about humans from almost every other thing in the universe. That's not impossible. um, but if you proceed from a purely positivist attitude that everything is calculable, everything is determined by cause and effect, it can be very hard to find a basis for where this acausal free will comes in, where it's just the voluntarily governing decisions of the ego consciousness. That's a very difficult argument. And I think that's why when Nietzsche's in this positivist phase, he very much adopts that position, basically. I don't know
Well,
if you had
that's
any
interesting.
response to that before we move on. Yeah.
Well, I guess I would just say that isn't that more of just a question begging argument against free will? Like we're
It might well be.
in the way, like in the way that you phrased it, we're already assuming that every effect, everything in the world is fully explained and necessitated by prior determining conditions. I mean, if you assume that, yeah, you're going to rule out libertarian freedom.
Mm-hmm.
But that's not so much, in my mind, an argument against libertarian freedom. It's just, I mean, they would grant that. They would say, yes, if you have determinism built into your worldview, you'll have no place for free will given its nature. That's not a response to everything you said, but the logical positivist critique, I mean, I think the libertarian would just say, you're right. You can't think that
Sure.
every effect is fully explained or necessitated by prior causal conditions. They would just say that's right. Is that,
I think
I mean, I don't know, am I missing something?
I'm really glad you brought that up, because where Nietzsche goes from there is so what I would say is that it's around this time when Nietzsche discovers Spinoza. Spinoza
Hmm.
also denies free will, and it's interesting because Spinoza is sort of like he's like the god of the atheists or the scientists. Like Einstein famously said he believed in the god of Spinoza, and that's because Spinoza makes nature into God, and then says all of us are just modifications of nature. So it's sort of pantheist in a way. But he denies that God has a will or a personal will, and then he denies that any of the modifications have any sort of personal free will. And I think the intuitive reason why the like sort of positivist approach to this question, I think, lands that way is because if you're doing a scientific experiment, you have to assume causality in that way. And so, like, what is the basis for exempting human beings? But I'm really glad you brought up that idea of, well, that's just assuming that it's subject to this like cause and effect framework. Like you're assuming this deterministic world. And that's actually the turn that Nietzsche makes. That leads him to a really strange position that I don't know if it is characterized by any of the existing labels that we use in the free will debate, because he ends up rejecting libertarian free will and determinism. And there's a quote I pulled up that I want to read, or I've got a couple of them. They're pretty short. This is an unpublished note from the Zarathustra period. He says, quote, "I laugh at your free will and at your unfree one too. What you call will is delusion to me. There is no will," end quote. Another one from Twilight of Idols, quote, "At the beginning stands the great fatality of error, that the will is something that is effective, that the will is a faculty. Today we know that it is merely a word." And then there are a number of passages in Twilight of Idols as well, the Four Great Errors, where Nietzsche sort of critiques and deconstructs this entire idea of causality, of cause and effect. Not trying to make a statement, like a metaphysical statement about the necessary untruth of causality. But there's an important through line from Kant, insofar as Kant argued that the thing in itself, like these frameworks of time and space and cause and effect, are ways that our minds structure the phenomenal world. That we don't actually discover those through pure reason. Oh, sorry. Gotcha. Okay. So we don't actually discover those faculties through pure reason. We don't discover the existence of time and space and cause and effect through empiricism either, or notions like the future will be like the past, like David Hume's critique of induction. Kant's argument is that these are synthetic judgments a priori. We know them prior to experience. And Schopenhauer takes this, who is Nietzsche's great influence, and he was greatly influenced by Kant. And he looks at this and says, again, vastly fast tracking and oversimplifying the argument, that, okay, if time and space and causality are not part of the thing in itself, the world in itself, but are ways that our minds structure the world, then that would mean that the thing in itself is timeless and spaceless and acausal. And the important difference from Nietzsche, from Schopenhauer then sort of comes up with this whole theory of the will as this like monistic substance, as one thing, because it would be timeless and spaceless and acausal. And Nietzsche, I would describe the turn that he makes around this time where he sort of like leaves the Spinozist position, he leaves the positivist position, is really when he comes up with the theory of will to power, which in many important ways is almost like a repudiation of the idea of will, which is very funny. People who think they understand Nietzsche, oh, he said everything was will to power. And then you read these passages like the one I just read, where he says, well, to those who know, there is no will. And there is no causality other than what our mind, brings to bear on the interpretation of phenomenon. What is he getting at with this? I think the way to understand it is that when he critiques the will, one of the things he points out is that Schopenhauer thought the will was the most obvious thing in the world. Like he said, Schopenhauer's whole thought process is, I'm going to look within myself because I'm simultaneously an object in the world and a perceiver of objects. Therefore, I have access to the inner content of myself as an object. And because the thing in itself is the same thing, all objects have the same inner content as I have. So there's huge leaps in logic here that we could certainly criticize. But, Schopenhauer's entire process, one of the ways that Nietzsche critiques it is actually by saying, what have you explained by calling it will? And he points out how what we call will is actually a complex, that we've confounded several things under one label, and that he says it's a unity in name only under which a popular prejudice lurks. In another passage, he says what Schopenhauer did was take the most ancient religious prejudices and translate them into a philosophical language. What does he mean by that? Well, he's saying the reason why we came up with the idea of like the will of the gods was that we were analogizing from a personal being with conscious intentions to saying that's the reason why the village flooded or something like that. It was the gods willed it, right? So then you're imputing will to these inanimate objects, and then that becomes explanatory by analogy because you're basically looking at your own inner content the same way Schopenhauer did, and using it to explain the world. Nietzsche's critique of this again is to say, okay, what do we actually see when we look to our inner content? The same way that he critiqued Descartes' statement, I think, is an immediate certainty. When we say I will, what are we saying? He's like, well, willing, what is that? I mean, that involves muscular sensations. That involves like maybe a pull towards something, but it could also be a push away from something. Will also could involve thought and interpretation. And will also could involve, feelings, affects, impulses, all of these things. That the important thing about all these things that I've brought up is that they're non-identical. Like we don't think that they share a common identity of like your thoughts with your muscular sensations, and yet they'll all get sort of, at least in philosophy up to that time, categorized under the name will. And then they think that they've explained something by saying, well, is that will thing that we've just defined free or unfree? And Nietzsche would say, well, we haven't even established what the will is. We're confounding all of these unequal things under the same name. And so Nietzsche's will to power doctrine, the departure from Schopenhauer is that his was monistic. It was also will to live. It referred back to the thing. Like he said, the fundamental will is the will to live. Things want to continue existing the way they are. Nietzsche's will to power is pluralistic. He basically says what you have is multiple wills, and what it is that they will is never pre-established. Like it doesn't just refer back to them. It refers to growth, self-overcoming, pushing them out beyond themselves. And what that means is different for every single force or every single kind of entity. And so what Nietzsche actually does with the free will question, I know I've just thrown a lot at you, but what he actually does is really complicates the situation and says that when we say, I believe in free will or I believe in unfree will, whether we say it's determined or undetermined, we're treating it as this magically effective force that, or in the case of the deterministic situation, we're treating it as a cause. But again, what is it that is the cause when we just say the will? You're like, your will was caused by other things, like that it's an effect of, and then it is the cause of your actions. What is that thing that we're referring to? And that the word almost refers to so many things that it almost refers to nothing at all. It becomes a placeholder. It becomes an X. It becomes a sort of again, a popular prejudice. And so I've been talking for a long time, so I want to give you the opportunity to kind of.
No, no, you're good. I need the time to think about these new ideas, and this is all going to be off the top of my head. But I wonder if Nietzsche is a bit over dramatic in what he thinks he's doing by pointing out that like will is a unclear, vague concept. I think that's right. I think that's absolutely right. That like, what does it mean to will something? What is our will? It means different things in different contexts, and your philosophers will debate like what things influence the will. And there's really some serious conceptual ambiguity, and so I grant that. But like, I feel like you could paraphrase the relevant or central free will questions without then referring to will. And so you could just say, are my choices at a time t free or determined? Like, are my choices at a time t up to me, or are they not? Could I have made a different choice at that time, or could I not have? So I guess by talking about choices, which are more concrete, I guess we avoid like this vague concept of will. Is that too simple a response?
No, but I think it points us to something really, really interesting. And well, there's an interesting connection between Nietzsche's views and a a viewpoint that might be unexpected for some, which would be Buddhism. And that's when you say my choices. A lot of what Nietzsche's critique of the will dovetails into is actually involved with his entire deconstruction of identity that many people have pointed out bears remarkable similarity to the Buddhist critique of the self. Of they break the self down into the five aggregates, that they're aggregates. So what is the argument there? That the five skandhas, or heaps of things that we group together that make up the self, are not themselves identical. And then even within themselves, they contain non-identical things. And so that identity is sort of like a post hoc, again, it might be something akin to causality from Nietzsche's perspective. It's important to point out Nietzsche thinks a lot of these things are errors, but he says truth is the kind of error that we find most indispensable for life. So, from the perspective of our perceptual systems that we need to survive and operate in the world, we kind of have to like make non-identical things identical. I mean, it's a really easy example, but I could say this coffee cup is this one thing, or is it trillions of particles? Well, technically it's both, but on the level of our perceptual systems, those intermediary concerns of the intellect don't really factor into it, right? In terms of what we see and what we interact with, it's way more intuitive and basic than that. Now, is that we're not really pointing to the untruth of our perceptual system so much as saying like there might be multiple true ways of viewing the world, but we go with the one that is like most powerful, is what Nietzsche would say, and that there's much of that underneath science. So in any case, when we talk about my choices, so what Nietzsche would say is that the thing that's making choices is actually multiple, and that's where he has this theory of drives, like various ways that philosophers talk about this. If you go back to like ancient Greek philosophy, they'll talk about affects or passions. If you speak in more modern neuroscientific terms, you might speak of impulses or something like that. But what Nietzsche would say about the structure of thought itself is that your thoughts aren't coming from like one place, like one mind that has a will and makes these decisions. It's a very interesting thing because people will often point out how Nietzsche says that there's no thinking without willing. There's like no dispassionate, disinterested form of thought that's just purely abstract and removed from who and what you are. But the other side of that coin is, he says, there's no willing without thinking. So actually, all your willing is suffused with mentation. And that's a very strange argument because basically what he's saying is like your impulse for like hunger even has its own kind of like logic to it. It has its own ruling thought. So, or like even your sexual impulse has its own ruling thought, or your fear, your self-preservation impulse has its own kind of ruling thought. And that like what's actually happening in your cognition is that multiple sources are sort of like, they don't, you have these thoughts and they don't come with a stamp of origin. What your consciousness is doing is kind of stitching all this together as an emergent property. And one of the things, I think you brought this up to Huemer, but it's an example I love, is like the hungry judge example of, right. but so much of what we think, and what we think is coming from like up here, is actually coming from the gut. Like there's a very serious link between like anxiety and depression and diet, and or exercise or things of that nature. And so when all of these factors in our body have the ability to affect what kind of thoughts we have, I think that's a really it's not solely, it doesn't get us from start to finish logically speaking, but I'm invoking it because it's a really persuasive, intuitive way to get people to kind of see what I'm gesturing towards. That what the way Nietzsche thinks, the source of your thoughts and therefore the source of your decisions, your rational decisions, could actually be multiple. And that what your rationality is actually, its function is like, that you're really like the sort of like, you could conceive of it as like the Platonic view of the self, or the Cartesian view sees the self as like a monarchy. And Nietzsche would say you're more like a squabbling oligarchy of drives that each have their own opinion and their own agendas, and a lot of the time they cooperate, but sometimes they compete. And what rationality is it's a weapon that gets seized on by the triumphant force in the struggle in order to represent to the self why it did what it did. And that it's always sort of post hoc and after the fact. And that importantly, that's what he thinks the entire like structure of morality really is in an important way, at least on a personal level. Morality is often like the rationalization of the principles you believe you hold, like the synthesis of that with what you actually do, which may not have anything to do with those principles. Or you might argue in a more sophisticated way, those principles are sort of the principles that you deserve according to who and what you are, or that you're destined to have, or something like that. So I I think he even complicates the question of asking, are my choices free? Because he would say that most people ask that question from the perspective of identifying themselves with the ego consciousness. And he would say that's not actually who
Yes.
you are.
Yes. I think so that's helpful. The comparison to Buddhist thought is very apt. I remember taking several courses in Buddhist philosophy and being fascinated by this doctrine of no self, that when you peer into your internal life, into your own mind, and reflect upon what goes on there, you'll observe thoughts and feelings and intentions and desires and memories and other mental states streaming by, but you won't observe the self, a self.
Mhm.
And so the idea, as I understand it, is just that the self is a complex of the five skandhas at any given time. It's
Mhm.
just an idea that we impose upon this complex, and we say, well, this is you, but there's no core self. There's just the thoughts, the intentions, the stream
I
of
think that's the
consciousness,
key,
and we
the no
bundle it all
core.
together and we say you, but there's no like core ego, or no self, no soul that is the thing that's you. There's just these different things that we decide to wrap up together and treat as one thing. Is that the idea that Nietzsche advances to? And then specifically with respect to the will, it's just this complex of factors that we regard as one unified thing, but in truth, it just is irreducibly multiple things.
It I think yes to all of that. And then another interesting parallel with Buddhism is the way that they view causality. So cause and effect, I would say again, like, I guess pragmatically speaking, you kind of have to believe in cause and effect in order to do Buddhist practice, because you would have to believe that your desire causes your suffering and vice versa. But when you get into like the deep Buddhism, like early early Zen writings like Bodhidharma's treatise of the two entries and four practices, and the way he describes causality, I remember when I was a Buddhist for a little while, and that really blew my mind, because the way he's talking about causality, he's like, well, look, dependent origination, no phenomena is separate from any other phenomena. Every time you do that, you're like abstracting it, in a quite literal sense of taking it away from the web of causes and conditions that created it. And that in the final analysis, we might say causality in that way kind of breaks down, because you're forced to say that everything causes everything else at every moment. Like if you can't abstract one cause from the chain, like we tend to think of it as a chain, like a bunch of billiard balls striking into each other one after the other, when really it's like this interpenetrating like web or something like that. Another Buddhist example is using Indra's net. Indra is a figure from Hindu mythology, and they have this image of his net of like it's like mirrored jewels that each reflect all of the others. It's like an infinite number of jewels, each reflecting an infinite number of other jewels, so that none of them actually show anything in themselves. They're just reflecting the others. It's like a very difficult, yeah. And so thinking about that in relation to Nietzsche, um, I think he would say he makes some very interesting critiques of causality that can be compared to that, where he basically says like when we try and say that something caused something else, like we're always standing from one point in the present and then either looking backwards or forwards, and we can do a finite number of calculations and be like, okay, we're at point E and D caused E and C caused D and B caused C and A caused B, and there we go. And he's like, well, you forgot about the infinite number of causes before that. The thing is, you can't, obviously, we don't have an infinite amount of time to calculate every last cause or factor of something. So we always have to sort of, again, abstract or pluck something out and say that was the cause. But you could always analyze it further. You could always calculate further back. It's just that we don't have the capability to do that really. And so if we want to get into like, if you really want to get into explaining what caused your will to act in a certain way, you would have to include the entire fabric of the known universe or something like that to really explain it. And that's one of the things that Nietzsche says that sort of ties in with his life philosophy. And it is still very similar to Spinoza, that he says every person is a piece of fate. If you wished for your one thing about you to be different, you'd have to wish for the entire universe to be different. Like it's absolutely necessary who you are as a consequence of every single factor in the universe. And that's so that does, again, when I'm trying to explain to people what Nietzsche's position on free will is, it's very important that I convey to them that it does reject the free will libertarian position, and he doesn't necessarily seem at odds with the hard determinist position. And yet he would even say that that whole framework of cause and effect on the level of determining your will as being caused or affected, even that kind of breaks down on some level. Because again, it still relies on confounding you with the ego consciousness, and it still relies on this sort of like billiard ball chain of causes and effects that isn't the real picture, so to speak.
But I wonder that if we could say that at the end of the day, Nietzsche is a hard determinist, even though he rejects presuppositions of the free will debate that are often taken for granted on both sides, like the existence of a self or the intelligibility of the concept of will, that it has content. Nevertheless, I feel like if push came to shove, based on what you're saying, Nietzsche would agree that the state of the universe at present is entirely necessitated or determined by the state of the universe at a prior time. And so by defining determinism as a statement about the universe, I think you can sidestep this issue of the ultimate interconnectedness of all things, because you're saying like this time slice of everything of the universe is necessitated by what came before it. So that when you think about the universe as a whole, there is no forking off point in its future where it could go one way or the other. And so in that respect, he's a hard determinist. It's just that the statements of determinism have to be very subtle once you get to more specific affairs like a person or a choice or a will. Maybe. What do you think?
Yeah. No, I think it's correct. So there's just like asterisks or caveats to that I would add. And I think maybe one way to look at it is that Nietzsche is still like post-Kantian in some ways, that he has like a really unusual theory of time that would probably take us way too far off track to get into. But I'm not even really convinced that Nietzsche believes, quote unquote, in like time and space as absolute facts or something like that. So I think it's on that level where he's saying like from like the God's eye view or something like that, I reject free will and unfree will. But we don't live in that world in that perspective. we have a certain human perspective that we all like exist on the same kind of scale of reality. A human life, we kind of exist on the same time scale, something like that. I mean, like in Nietzsche's early writings, he has a lot of these really interesting thought experiments. Like they did von Bayer did these pulse rate experiments where they basically determined that, or he thought that certain organisms at a higher pulse rate would actually experience time faster. That like our experience of the passage of time even is sort of subjective, or subjective is the wrong word. It's really relative. So Nietzsche experiments with all of that, and I think he was keenly aware of that. But again, like I was saying earlier, like we have certain truths that are indispensable for us, or that we can't help but see the world any other way. And I think on that level of perception, he would say, yeah, it's not true, but yeah, on that phenomenal world level of perception, determinism is basically does characterize Nietzsche's position. I think so. It's just that the other asterisks I would like to add to that is that I think Nietzsche is also aware that, or it would be his position, that you can't necessarily logically think your way through to the end of determining, like you can't grasp or cognize the noumenal truth of whether we have free will or not. Like it's kind of bound to be a question that people are going to continue debating for thousands of years. And so oftentimes the way that he actually approaches this question is by looking at like the psychological history or the anthropological history of why people held the views that they do about free will. Like supposing that none of us have, again, access to directly, as Russ Cole would say in True Detective, like mainline the secret truth of the universe, and we're just existing in a phenomenal reality. Um, if we accept that set of circumstances, then I guess I'm trying to think of like the right way to put this. That the reason why people believe in free will, or the reason why they would believe in determinism, unfree will, there's that passage in Beyond Good and Evil, I believe it's number 21, where he sort of says that's going to reflect like your psychological temperament. And the funny thing about this is that the argument itself almost presupposes determinism in the sense that we're talking about, right? Your beliefs aren't actually based on the rational decision you've made. It's based on something unconscious in you, like a ruling thought of your unconscious drives that's triumphed. So it's like a presupposition of the argument. But that being said, again, I think in a very persuasive, intuitive sense, even if it's not doesn't get us there all the way there logically, many of us it will like ring true to us that many of the people who are going to like gravitate more towards determinism will probably be people who, like, he brings up the argument of sort of like the bleeding hearts who wanna let criminals off the hook, right? Or people who maybe haven't been as successful in life. And he's like, meanwhile, free will, he thinks, comes from like the belief in free will originated probably with aristocratic classes who really had faith in themselves as being a cause. That like you're really going to grab onto that idea and affirm the idea that you have free will when you don't feel like your will's being imposed on by outside sources. And so it's very funny because you look at that and you're like, okay, he's starting from a deterministic presupposition to argue for psychological origins for our beliefs. The psychological picture he gives is very unflattering to the unfree will position, and it's more flattering to the free will position from Nietzsche's aristocratic elitist perspective, anyway. And that's exactly the opposite of what he would say the quote unquote truth of the matter is. And then that brings in the whole question of, is it more important that we're objectively truthful, quote unquote? Well, Nietzsche doesn't even believe in that necessarily. Versus, is it more important that we seize on an idea that is more life preserving or life promoting? And so that's why there are important complications in how he thinks about this. But I think you're correct. You could classify it as determinist, but then it's like he always complicates things that way, where he's almost bringing
Right.
in, yeah, it might be better to believe in free will.
I couldn't help but think, as I was listening to you articulate the caveats, that I think if I ever sat down with Nietzsche for a conversation, I would become incredibly frustrated. I think, I think that I think it ultimately would be unfruitful because I would lose my cool because he would constantly reject foundational basic assumptions that are almost always taken for granted by disagreeing parties in these kinds of conversations. And so, for example, if I were discussing with somebody whether or not determinism was true and they replied by thinking, well, I don't even think space and time really exist. I mean, I just like, all right, man, we got to talk some other day. I wasn't prepared for this. But that doesn't mean he's wrong. It's just that I think that's why, like, when we now turn to discussing how Nietzsche's views and arguments would interact with someone like Michael Huemer, like the common ground between them is very few and far between, and it's hard to have a productive dialogue when you come at it from two radically different places. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I do. Well, so I'll say a couple things. First, just a general comment on what you said. Uh, I think one of the things Nietzsche might point out about sort of that whole thing of like, oh, well, I don't even believe time and space is true, and you're like, well, we all kind of accept this. Even both opposing sides of the issues will accept basic truths like that, so that they can have a conversation about it, right? Like just almost like as a matter of pragmatism. And Nietzsche would say, that's right. It's because those ideas are useful, they're powerful, we almost don't care about their objective truth in some sense for the purposes of just, well, okay, but we have to assume that to have a discussion. That's just like the most useful, commonly accepted thing. And like, just go with that. That's what has always worked. We use language like that so often to justify scientific and philosophical positions. And that almost points back to like his position that in a way that we're not concerned with the objective truth in like the grand noumenal sense of it. We're actually concerned with what works and what like furthers human life. And like so often, how are scientific advancements like sold to the populace by like what they'll do for us and how it'll improve the human condition? And so I think that's like a really important point that is worth noting. The other thing with Humer's point is that, as I brought up at the beginning, he zeroes in on this idea that the moral duty, and I would say that he's phrasing it as a moral duty that you should only believe what's true, as being sort of a prerequisite to dialogue, and the fact that determinists are sort of prohibited from invoking that, which is a real problem, you could say. I think Nietzsche would totally agree. He would just be from the other side that he completely rejects the idea of moral responsibility. He sees moral responsibility as, just like we talked about with the elephant lynching at the beginning, that even when we apply that to human beings, that's like a myth and an error. And again, that might not mean that it's not indispensable for human society. So often people will bring this up. Christopher Hitchens famously said, we must believe in free will because we have no choice. I've heard Jordan Peterson say things like, well, if you reject free will, you're just rejecting the entire moral and legal basis of our society. So, good luck with that one, bucko, or whatever you would say.
And
And
neither of those amounts to an argument for thinking that the relevant belief is true. It's just saying
right,
it's indispensable, but that's compatible with its being ultimately false. So I think that's what's
sure,
interesting.
right, and that's so often what we have to lean on with the free will argument is you're threatening this idea of moral responsibility, and do you really want to go there? And Nietzsche says in Human All Too Human, this truth is as bright as sunlight. He's saying the truth that we have no intelligible freedom is as bright as sunlight, but everyone prefers to walk back into the shadow for fear of the consequences. And that it's really the fear of the consequences of the belief. Now, I'm not saying that's what Huemer is doing, but I'm saying like they're both like from kind of opposite angles. I think like actually zero in on what's beneath the free will debate in a really important way, which is this like moral responsibility piece. Because that is, I think, the most important thing that comes out of Huemer's argument is the lack of moral responsibility in the deterministic worldview, and then the fact that undoes your ability to even have a debate about it because you can't say that the opponent should believe anything other than what they already believe. How could you possibly make that claim?
Yes. So I think that is a good segue into an explicit statement of Huemer's argument. I will read it out because I think that it does have some important implications. Whether or not it ultimately proves what Huemer thinks it does, I don't know, but it points to exactly what you're saying, that there are certain presuppositions we make in rational discourse or in thinking there's such a thing as rationality that don't seem to fit into a deterministic worldview. And
Mm-hmm.
really cashing out then what it implies when you reject those presuppositions ought to make you uncomfortable at the very least. And so here's what his argument is. So first, he defines the minimal free will thesis as the claim that at least some of the time I have more than one course of action open to me. That's kind of what we've been calling libertarian freedom. At least some of the time I have more than one course of action open to me. And then here's his argument. One, with respect to the free will issue, we should refrain from believing falsehoods. Two, whenever I should do a certain thing, it is the case that I can do that thing. Three, if determinism is true, then whatever we can do is what we actually do. Four, I believe the minimal free will thesis. So those are the four premises. And then what follows? Well, five, with respect to the free will issue, we can refrain from believing falsehoods. This falls from 1 and 2. 6, if determinism is true, then with respect to the free will issue, we do in fact refrain from believing falsehoods from 3 and 5. 7, if determinism is true, then the minimal free will thesis is true from 6 and 4. And 8, the minimal free will thesis is true. Now, this is a complex argument. It is logically valid. That is to say, if the four premises are true, the conclusion will follow. Now, it doesn't bear that immediately on its face. You have to sit with it and connect the dots a bit. But I think if you do that, and I'll link to a brief paper Huemer wrote summarizing the argument, you can at least get the idea. You see the connections and you go, okay. So that if, and we can look at it in a bit more detail to walk through it here. But that first claim, with respect to the free will issue, we should refrain from believing falsehoods. Most of us will initially grant that. Okay, that seems reasonable. We shouldn't believe what's false. And in general, so specifically with respect to debating free will, we should refrain from believing falsehoods. But then that second claim, whenever I should do a certain thing, it has to be the case that I can do that thing. It's just unintelligible to talk about obligations I might have to do things that I have no ability to do. And so, if you say that to someone, you should go pick up your nephew from daycare, because otherwise no one's going to pick him up. You have an obligation. You should go do that. Well, if I were physically incapable of doing that, so I was stuck at the airport and had no way of getting out, well, then it's not the case that I should go pick up my nephew. So whenever I should do a certain thing, it has to be the case that I can, at the very least, do it. The third claim is then, if determinism is true, then whatever we can do is what we actually do. That follows, given how we've defined determinism, that there can't be any powers I have to do certain things, any abilities I have, like I can do X. But in fact, I chose to do Y. That's not compatible with determinism. Whatever I can do in a robust sense is what I actually do. And then 4, I believe the minimal free will thesis. I believe that at least some of the time there are courses of action open to us. Well, then it will follow that if we grant those 4 premises, in some sense, determinism is self-refuting, I think is the ultimate, is the implication. If you grant those 4 premises, you'll end up in a self-refuting situation where determinism implies that free will actually exists, that libertarian free will exists. So there you go. I've yet to say any problems with it, and I will leave it to you if you want to add on to it first before critiquing it.
Yeah, I mean, I guess maybe to not necessarily add on to the argument, but first, another thing I admire about it is that he's going to, is that Huemer is not a compatibilist, and he is trying to, I think compatibilism is I guess you could technically hold compatibilist views even within this argument, but I personally very much dislike compatibilism and the fact of trying to mediate these two mutually exclusive positions. It is funny because Nietzsche tries to deny both of them, but I don't know. I think there's too much glib dismissal about the free will issue, and there's too much attempts to mediate our way out of it. And this, I mean, if you take the argument seriously, you would have to believe that free will is true, at least to some extent. And in my view, that would exclude determinism. I guess what I would say, the first thing I would say with my problem with the argument is that I think there's a category confusion or a confounding again of non-identical things with the word should here. And the example I remember Huemer used when he spoke with you was a professor telling a student you should come to class. A student who misses class, for example. And let's say the student broke every bone in their body and it's physically impossible for them to come to class. And, they tell the professor that. So it was impossible. And he says, nevertheless, you should still come to class. And we would all recognize that as illogical. It's sort of unfair. You're imposing a moral duty on someone that they're literally unable to fulfill. We would all say, no, anytime you say that someone should do something, it implies that they can do it. The issue is that I'm not sure that it's the same sort of statement or the same sort of sense of the word should being invoked when we say that you shouldn't believe false things or you shouldn't believe falsehoods. And what I mean by that is there's a sense in which we use the term should that really refers to like an optimal condition. And what we're saying in that sense is if you want to have a rational discourse or a dialogue, you have to adopt the framework of not believing in false things. And there are people who will actually hold to that position. I choose not to believe false things. I mean, some of the people who will make these statements very strongly are like the most fringe conspiracy theorists who will say, I've decided I am not going to believe anything false, and that's why I believe that the earth is flat or something like that. They'll uphold those same moral principles. Now, does that mean that everything that they believe is actually true? No, it might have to do. The issue is that believing whether something is true or not doesn't just have to do with your commitment to a principle of believing things are true. You might actually just not have the correct knowledge or the correct capacities or capabilities. So you might well have a situation in which you even have two interlocutors who are having a rational discussion, who both put forward the idea, yes, we should not believe falsehoods, who both do believe falsehoods. And I think, so on the one hand, if we just zoom out from before I get into the nitty gritty of the argument, I don't think most people would say intuitively, at least, that that's actually what determinism implies, that no one could believe false things under determinism. Like they might just not have the correct knowledge. So that's kind of one issue I have with the argument. But the other thing is that I don't think that it's actually. So the example that I used would be that a professor might actually say that to a student. Like they might not actually have been able to come to class and they might say, nevertheless, you should. And what they mean by that is not you had a moral duty to do something that you couldn't actually do, and they're unfairly or illogically imposing it on the student. They're again making a statement of optimal, in order to have the optimal situation for a student, that student should come to class. And we often make these statements, even in times where the thing in question can't be done. Another example I used is if somebody, I'm going to use car salesman, and he says, what kind of car do you want? I say, well, the car should have an automatic transmission. They might not actually have any cars that have one. Am I like illogically imposing a duty on this person that he can't fulfill? No, I'm saying the optimal condition that I need to meet of an if-then statement, like to use Kantian language, a conditional imperative, not a categorical one, requires that this be fulfilled. That doesn't mean it actually is fulfilled. And it doesn't mean, so therefore, I think what's happening then when you then say, well, everything we should do, we can do. Well, from that sense of a conditional imperative of just the optimal conditions, that's not actually the case. It's not actually the case that everything we should do, we can do. And that would be, so that's kind of like my first objection to the argument, or like really my main objection, is that we're reasoning from like this should as an absolute, as like a categorical moral imperative, to a statement about like affecting what people actually can do in the world. And what I would argue is that the sense that you're using that, I mean, I think Huemer would actually say that he is using, perhaps, you should not believe falsehoods as an absolute moral imperative. I'm not totally certain he would say that that's an absolute, but what I would say is that the reason, I don't think that it actually is. That would be my charge. That it isn't actually an absolute moral imperative. Because if it were, wouldn't people be incapable of believing false things even if they had made that commitment? Which in fact they're not. Like, people make that commitment all the time and still believe false things because they just don't have correct information, or they're actually just not capable of it. It might actually be the case that they're not capable of it. So I don't know. I guess I'll stop. Give you a
Yeah,
chance.
so I think you're drawing attention to a very important point, which I think is the weakest aspect of this argument, is that there are multiple definitions of should. There are, I think what you're drawing a distinction between is hypothetical obligations and categorical obligations. So, or a hypothetical use of should and a categorical use of should. So, the hypothetical use would be, if you want to accomplish a certain end, then you should do X. That's a hypothetical use of should. And that doesn't imply, if that's the use of should you have in mind, like if you want to do well in your introduction to economics, you should show up for class. You can assert that hypothetical even if the student in question has no ability to attend the class. So with that hypothetical should, premise 2 of his argument is false. When I should do a certain thing, it is the case that I can do that thing. If we have the hypothetical should in mind, that's just not the case. Now, I undoubtedly think that Huemer has in mind the categorical should, that we might say in the case of I should not murder. I think Kant was right that we don't mean that in a hypothetical way of, if I want to be a good person, then I shouldn't murder. Rather, the relevant obligation is categorical and absolute. You should not murder. There's no conditions that have to obtain in order for that to follow. It's just saying you should not murder. And so I think what Huemer would say is, that's right if we plug in a hypothetical should into the argument and make it univocal, the meaning the same throughout, premise 2 will be false. Mm-hmm. But if we stick with the categorical should, then premise 2 will be true once again. And I think that's right, that if someone says you should not murder, it wouldn't make sense to assert that to someone who was physically compelled to murder, right? Where they had no ability to refrain. For example, I'm using a negative versus a positive version, but the idea is the same. So then once we plug in the categorical should, premise 1 becomes, with respect to the free will issue, we should refrain from believing falsehoods. So then it seems like your claim will be, well, then it's no longer clear that that premise is true.
Right.
Because we seem to be able, it seems that, and I might agree with you. I might agree with you that we at least will all agree with a hypothetical should in that case, that, if you want to have beliefs that mirror reality, then you should refrain from believing falsehoods. I mean, I think we would obviously we'd all agree with that. It's harder for me to establish the absolute obligation, the absolute status that we attach to moral obligations to this particular obligation, this epistemic obligation about beliefs. We just should refrain from believing falsehoods. I think it's a plausible claim, but I guess I don't know how I would argue for it.
Well, it's a plausible claim. That's the thing. Like, as you brought up Kant, I mean, Kant would certainly argue for that position. Right. But it's not clear to me that the strong Kantian style categorical should is actually required as a prerequisite for having the free will debate. That to me is the real issue, is that it seems that the conditional should is, or the hypothetical should is enough. That in respect to, like, if we want to have a productive discourse, we have to agree not to believe false things. Or if I want to mirror reality with my thought, I have to agree to not believe in false things. But it's not clear to me that I have to accept that categorical version, or that there's a really a strong argument that somehow my position collapses if I don't. Because again, as you say, the argument that is more persuasive to me or rings true to me is the idea that that's an optimal condition. And it is because of the fact that plenty of people will uphold it as an absolute and still themselves believe false things. Because again, how would I put this? It's I don't see the absolute statement of should doing any work in reality. And that might be a little too continental, but I don't see how I don't see the functional difference, I guess, for fostering like a rational investigation of reality between the hypothetical or the categorical statement of should. Like, I don't see what the distinction would be or what the difference would be in the distinction that would require me to make a categorical statement that you should always believe uh, true things and not false things. I also would say I do have another problem with reasoning from that should to, because this is sort of the issue, right? It's like, even if humor was to get me like present, like let's just say he presents Kant's argument and forces me to agree with it or something like that. I don't know if
Right.
you would agree with Kant's argument, but even if I were to agree with it, there's something in my gut that tells me like, okay, even if every human being on earth assents to the fact that it is a categorical duty, that doesn't actually seem to constrain what human beings actually can do, even within the deterministic framework. It might be the case that we're mistaken. Like, if that makes any sense, like it might be the case that we all believe that we only should believe things that are true, but that actually, what if we all believe that and we're incapable of doing it?
I
Right?
think, yeah, but I don't know that that says anything inconsistent or contradictory to Huemer's argument. I think he would agree with you that
Mhm.
from a deterministic stance, if everybody on the planet believed a certain thing, that doesn't mean it's true, because they would
Mhm.
just be determined to believe that way, and they could fail in that case to execute the moral obligation they believe obtains, or the obligation to cultivate true beliefs that they believe obtains, because they couldn't have done otherwise. But he would just say that premise one is plausibly true. That all
Hmm.
four premises are plausibly true before, and the determinist might agree, but that when the determinist works through their mutual implications, they will see that their position can't affirm those four claims. And so perhaps at that point they reject them. But that's just to save the determinist worldview. I think Huemer would just assert each of these premises on their own is plausible. And so I really have to think here, like, that claim, I should only believe what's true, or I should avoid believing falsehoods. Those are roughly equivalent. But the point, I guess, that Huemer makes is that rationality has an irreducible normative element. So you
Mhm.
have a descriptive claim like, uh, this cup has a tablespoon of coffee left in it. That's just a descriptive claim. A normative claim would be, this cup of coffee ought to be full. Now, I think that's a false claim, but it's a claim about the way things ought to be. And so I think Huemer's point is that rationality and discourse about the truth and justification for our beliefs as a concept has an irreducible normative element to it. That to be rational is to be doing something you ought to do. Now, I don't know about that claim,
Mhm.
but on its face, this idea that we should refrain from believing falsehoods. I mean, I think most people would initially agree with that in its categorical form, even. Yeah,
Sure.
we should
Sure.
refrain from believing falsehoods, of course.
Yeah, I think the difficulty that I would have with reasoning from that to a it's I don't think it's just strictly intuitive, and I don't think it's something that, that comes out in the interrelationship of things that are all plausibly true, though, because I think that the statements that we make about how human beings should behave, like the statements that we're making about it, the claims that we're making about it, those are very important for, I mean, I would almost say like rhetorically important, right? Like, that's the real power, again, to maybe be very Nietzschean and Continental with it. The real power of invoking that principle is that your opponent can't rhetorically disagree with you, because then they're saying they might be saying false things to you, and then that completely collapses their entire position. It means that my position may or may not be based on truth, and that's untenable in any debate. But I suppose what I'm saying is that I don't actually see the link between what we say we should do and what people actually do or believe. Insofar as, again, everyone on earth could affirm that claim and still believe false things. I mean, and that normative element to rationality that he sees, again, like, well, you say you find it questionable. I would also find it somewhat questionable. Now, it might be actually true, like, again, in like a practical sense, insofar as, again, then this is to bring in Nietzsche, every rational statement we make has some sort of like evaluative judgment beneath it. So Nietzsche would actually really very much agree that there's a normative element to thought, probably in a very different way than Huemer would believe. But there's actually some daylight between them, which is somewhat fascinating, because he would say every perception you're making about the world has a value judgment involved with it, insofar as, like, even your sense organs represent like an evolutionary determination of the value of perceiving one thing and not another thing. And again, then going back to what we were talking about with at the beginning of the conversation, with the things that we believe, um, in some sense, like being indispensable for us independently of their like quote unquote objective truth. So he would say, like, every truth claim you're making, there's some sort of value judgment that's at the base of it. And one of those may well be that you might say it's almost like maybe like the normative structure of all rational thought, that maybe it's a value and judgment involved with all of them, that you ought to believe true things and not falsehoods or something like that. And we might say, to get around noumena and phenomena, true for us, true as far as the phenomenal world, true as far as we're concerned, true as far as, practicality is concerned. The this is where we might hit the impasse that you're talking about, though, is just standing from the more Nietzschean orientation. I'm perfectly comfortable with saying there could be things that are absolutely indispensable to believe that are nevertheless errors, and it doesn't prove them. And that's sort of how I treat that question of that categorical judgment that we shouldn't disbelieve falsehoods. That I see that as again, like how do we put this? Like, it's something that we might have to assent to in order to operate, but that doesn't get us anywhere to demonstrating it. In terms of determining that, people should behave that way and therefore they can behave that way, something like that. Now, again, it gets tricky because, as we pointed out at the beginning of the conversation, like, it does prevent the determinist from saying you should believe otherwise. But
to the libertarian.
But what if that is the case? I mean, like, can we not, is it not rigorously imaginable that the universe could be so constructed that there are beings that are so constituted that they believe false things and can't be argued out of that position?
Like,
and if that's the case,
one.
that's what's that? Yeah, well, sure. Or no, I mean, like, premise 4 is really what I'm saying. Like, what if it is that you have, like, that is false, but I also hold that you have no moral responsibility not to hold that false opinion, right? That might collapse our ability to, like, rationally mirror the world. But I guess I'm uncomfortable with excluding the possibility that human beings might be constituted in such a way that they believe false things.
I think that claim, though, has to be made if it's to refute Huemer's argument. You've got to make that claim about premise 1.
Sure.
Gotta
well, and I would.
Okay. Because, I think that he will insist, and I'll insist, that if you grant the 4 premises and you are a determinist, you can't avoid the conclusion. And so you have to get back to rejecting one of them. And so, I mean, he would agree with you that the argument isn't that determinism implies that everything we believe is true. It's that determinism implies that in conjunction with those 4 other claims. And so you've got to get back to the baseline of rejecting at least one of them. And it seems like what we're saying is that the most vulnerable one here will be that first premise. And the most that Huemer can say then on it in defense of it, other than just, well, look at it, it's plausible, is it's a presupposition of rational thought. And I catch glimpses of, like, what he means, and then they slip away. It's a complex and abstract point, but it's kind of like, how would you dialogue with somebody who said, I don't really think you should try to avoid believing falsehoods,
right,
or that you should try to cultivate true beliefs? Well, like how would you then proceed to try and get at the truth with them? Because they just they reject that base level assumption that we should try to pursue the truth. How would you get them to uh, change their mind and to about some viewpoint if they don't at least presuppose that the truth matters in this normative
Right.
sense? Like, and they might give the hypothetical analysis of should, and they'll say, well, I agree that if you want to have beliefs that mirror the world and avoid the pain that will come your way from having false beliefs about, say, a car that's pummeling towards you on the road,
Mhm.
you ought to believe what's true. But then they'll say, well, do you think that you should try to cultivate beliefs that mirror the world as they are? Well, no, I don't think you should. And then they might offer another hypothetical, but then you would go back to the antecedent condition and say, well, do you think you should do that? Ultimately, they'll say no. And so you're left in a situation where there's just no further way to dialogue with them because they don't even think that you should try to pursue the truth or have true
Mhm.
beliefs. So it's like I can kind of see that there's something to what he's saying about it being a presupposition of just rational dialogue in the first place. But I think what you're getting at is like, that doesn't mean that it's true.
Well, that's where I would kind of fall back on sort of maybe my Nietzschean orientation of that. What we're really referring to is getting rationality to work. Like what
Yes.
we're really referring, I mean, the example you use, and like it's a good example because you're saying, okay, well, how can I like productively even converse with someone who doesn't believe this? And that doesn't actually point to a rational bedrock for the belief. It points to the fact that we can't get what we want without
Mm, mm,
presupposing this.
mm,
That it yet again refers to like a pragmatic concern or I mean, again, like Nietzsche would say, at the most basic level, a power concern. You're saying, how can I convince them? How can I bring them over to my way of thought without getting them to assent to this position? And that's the issue where it might again be pragmatically or rhetorically for the best that we all agree to it. The other thing that I could point out, I mean, again, like I know it's not like a strictly analytical logical argument. There are plenty of people who will openly assent to that principle while even consciously not holding to it. And that's the other
mm.
thing about like this normative structure of thought that I'm very skeptical of in the sense that Huemer means it, because I think, as I pointed out in the initial comment I made, I'm always suspicious of arguments that reason from like moral statements about the world to like the way the world is, something like that. And again, that's something that's kind of like big picture. It's on the level of intuition and persuasion more so than deconstructing the argument. But I think it is something that, again, like as you say, the most vulnerable premise is premise one, and it's for that very reason. Um, I guess I would say to go back to your example, suppose that there is somebody who can't be convinced like that. I don't know. I guess again, like it may be the case that some people can't be convinced, but as I brought up with the flip side of it, there might be someone who will actually tell you, I do believe that I ought to not believe falsehoods, and then actually operates according to principles that they do believe falsehoods. I'm I don't know. I feel like I might be repeating myself a little bit, so I don't want to like get too bogged down in that. But I think that to me is the real issue: is the argument appeals to a kind of pragmatic intuition. I think at the end of the day, like the reason why people will believe it's plausibly true is because of the thing you're saying. That like, well, I won't be able to convince anyone of anything if that's not true. And yet, when we look to the pragmatic truth of the matter, it doesn't seem that that statement of assent actually does any work,
Mm.
if that makes sense.
Well, I think that's a keen insight that, at least the way I've spelled it out, you're really isolating a pragmatic concern about like how to rationally persuade people. It's hard when you're talking about a really foundational concept like rationality to
Mm,
get your grounding in what we're talking about, because it's not obvious
sure.
to me what rationality means. And so for Huemer to say something like, well, it's a presupposition of rational thought, Oh, okay, what does that mean? I think that it's right that we do, in our investigations of the world, in scientific discourse and empirical exploration and investigation, we assume that we should pursue the truth, that we should try to cultivate true beliefs, and we should try to avoid false beliefs. I think the trouble comes down to when you think as a philosopher and you question that assumption, how do you give an argument for it? I mean,
Yeah.
aside from arguments for it, do you ultimately reject that first premise then?
I would say I'm in the camp of saying I conditionally assent to it in the sense that I guess you could call it pragmatic, but in the same sense that I wouldn't want to, like you said, like what would be a good example? I mean, I wouldn't want to like if I were a student, I would want to come to class every day, and I could
Mm.
acknowledge that I don't always have the ability to do so. But it's not an absolute imperative that I should come to class every day. I'm trying to create the optimal conditions for learning and getting a degree or something like that in that case. And so in the same way, like if I want to engage in rational thought, and particularly I think I have been referring to dialogue a lot because I think this particularly does refer to dialectic, to engaging with other people. You That's when you really need to hold this as a moral principle, because otherwise, if we're just talking about a single solitary intellect, morals don't really come into it as strongly. I mean, I guess you could say it's like your personal principle, or something like that. But really, that's often when we refer to it is in the concern of whether or not our interlocutor is committed to not saying falsehoods to us, or to um, what would we say, not ignoring it when there's like something rational or true that's right in front of them. Like we want everyone to assent to that as a duty in order to really make dialectic possible, I think.
Right.
And so in that sense, I do assent to that viewpoint as, like, again, like a, you can call it pragmatic, whatever you want to call it, conditional, hypothetical, whatever it might be. I don't think it's an absolute moral imperative. And it is for the reason that I ultimately, you could call it a deterministic world, but in the sense that Nietzsche critiques free will, I that's one of my strongest points of agreement with him, is that I actually do not think that there is some sort of absolute moral responsibility on human agents. And I actually do go through the world thinking there are certain people that probably can't be convinced of anything. Not, or what might we say? That if I convince someone of something, there was already a series of causes and conditions leading up to that point that made it possible for them to assent to the point of view that I'm presenting to them. But I've spent enough time, again, to just speak in everyday, like worldly terms. I've spent enough time dialoguing with people who are like committed to a religious point of view, or as I talked about, like I have family members who are like gotten into conspiracy theories and things like that. And you realize at a certain point, it's like nothing I say rationally will convince you, but they will tell you that they believe in an absolute duty to seek the truth themselves. And you realize that it's actually, there might be an actual issue of like incapability there. And I think that completely fits, that actually fits with the world as I empirically experience it. That rationality does not actually have the power to persuade people. And it gets into perhaps uncomfortable territory for the moral realists when you read Nietzsche, because that's why he's such a fan of the Greek sophists. Because what they actually said was dialectic doesn't have the power to persuade people, because in the way that Socrates thinks, like aletheia, like it's revealing the truth to you. And therefore, like rationality is just binding on the mind, and you just have to assent to the truth when you know it's there, right? That would be like sort of the Socratic worldview in broad strokes. They would say, no, the sophistic view of dialogue would be that you should actually try to be persuasive, speak beautifully, that it's actually kind of like, I don't want to say manipulation, but that there's like artfulness, that there's like an aesthetics to communicating with human beings, and that they're going to believe things based on unconscious biases and prejudices and what suits their advantages and their interest. And so it might be the case that it suits our advantage, especially if we're an academic philosopher, to believe that you should not believe false things. That's just an example. But that people don't actually operate that way. And so, again, I mean, I guess that takes us into the weeds a little bit, but it is a way in which the deterministic world picture actually fits with my empirical experience of what human beings are like. And again, that I give Huemer credit for making me think about this, or like making me reflect about this, that like I can't impose the moral responsibility on others that they should believe in determinism or something like that. That's just simply not possible under that worldview.
Well,
And yeah, so
oh yeah, that's kind of what I was going to jump off of as I'm trying to spell out some implications of Huemer's argument or different angles from which to look at it to try and get a better idea of it and see its perhaps plausibility. That as a determinist, if you reject the absolute epistemic obligation that you should believe true things, you can't really condemn alternative viewpoints. So you can't really look at the libertarian and say that they are doing something irrational by believing a falsehood.
sure.
Maybe they have all sorts of evidence that libertarianism isn't true. It's maybe that free will, as they understand it, is incoherent, but they choose to believe it anyway. They choose to blind themselves to the evidence, to not read those articles or book chapters, and to just believe it. Well, the determinist can't say they're doing something irrational because that's the only course of action that they could have done. And if there's no ultimate evaluative component, like you should believe true things, because then the libertarian will turn back on them and say, like, perhaps the determinist would say, but libertarianism isn't true. It's false. So you shouldn't believe it. Well, you can't say that. They could just say it's false. And the libertarian could say, okay, so what? I'm going to believe in libertarianism. And all they could say is, all right. Like the determinist is forced to say that their viewpoint, which they regard as true, and any other false viewpoint, like libertarianism or compatibilism, they're evaluatively equal in a certain way. And it's hard to spell that out into an argument against determinism. Like that's what Huemer, I think, is ultimately trying to do. Mm-hmm. But I think it's at least an uncomfortable position for the hard determinist to be in. If they can't really say to the libertarian, you shouldn't believe libertarianism. They can't say that.
The way I would sort of take on that point, though, would be, again, to look at the issue of the very fact that I think everyone knows, like, so you brought up again how premise one is very intuitively plausible to a lot of people, or just seems self-evidently plausible. But I think the other side that we're pointing out with determinism is also self-evidently plausible to people. That, for one, just because something is true does not mean that people have to believe it. And there is something that is somewhat ironic, maybe not ironic, but it's funny to use this term, freeing about releasing yourself from the moral obligation of having to win people over to the side of determinism. You just say, well, that's sort of the belief they're destined to have. And that might be an implication of determinism, but on the other side of that coin, we might say, let's say that, I know you brought up like the Benjamin Libet experiments, which are, I agree with Huemer that they're very weak. And I also appreciated his argument very much that people need to stop glibly hand waving towards some scientific experiment and thinking that this like proves a philosophical point. The scientists are not necessarily qualified to draw philosophical implications from their work. But like, let's say that there was some sort of experiment that definitively proved that free will was false. Like it's just unmistakable, whatever it might be. One could say maybe people don't have the, like that, how do I put this? That the only thing then between like a determinist and a free will libertarian would be not a normative decision to believe what is true or what is false, but it might just be like a lack of information, knowledge. That ironically, you could say colloquially, and I don't mean this in the actual sense of free will libertarianism, but colloquially speaking, an increase of information actually broadens your choices of what to do. And that oftentimes these things are sort of conflated, I guess, somewhat in this debate, like truth or knowledge a with a moral obligation or a moral like decision, something like that. I mean, in that way, it's very similar to a lot of religious debates. I'm actually out of town from Austin, and I saw on the way up here a billboard that said "How to be saved." This is very. I'm in Texas, it's a very religious country, and it was like step one, two, three, and step two was believe in Jesus. And it's so funny to me because it's like there are even people who want to believe in Jesus who don't know how to. Like, it's not very clear to me that belief is subject to the will, at least not in the simple sense. And that oftentimes what changes someone's belief is not that they've assented to some sort of like moral position. It's just that like the evidence is just irrefutable to them or something like that. Now it's funny because I've said earlier that oftentimes people will believe what's not true based on unconscious biases and prejudices and all of these things, right? So you might say, well, is there a contradiction there? No, what I'm saying is that whether the belief is based on evidence or not, it's not actually based on a rational decision you made, in my
Right, right,
opinion.
right. It just flows from those other factors.
Right. And so if that is the case, yeah, it would be, I wouldn't be able to tell someone, no, you shouldn't believe in free will. But I don't see an essential contradiction with like presenting them evidence, right? Again, I'm not saying that evidence exists, but and so in the same way, like I use the example of a scientific experiment just to make it easy, but if I had the argument for determinism, say I present them with Nietzsche's critique of the will, and I'm like, well, what are you exactly saying by saying we have free will? Who is the we that has the will? What are you saying is the act of willing? What is that exactly? And they might come back at me and say, well, you have no moral basis for demanding that I assent to true beliefs, so I don't have to listen to any of this. Sure, they might say that. But like I would say most people, if they actually saw the evidence and believed it, it's not something that they would say, well, I don't have to morally. I'm not bound by a moral obligation to believe it. It's like, well, no, they've just been presented with information and it
Mm.
changes their view of the world. And that's maybe the through line for I think how determinists can get over this objection
Mm.
is that you're just presenting again. I'm not saying we're assuming for the sake of argument that determinism is true, but if we do
Right.
assume that, as Huemer does, all you're doing is presenting someone with new information, and if they have the capability to understand it and comprehend it, then they will. They don't really need the moral uh, like obligation or the assenting to that obligation to only believe what's true.
Well, that's the other, to use your metaphor again, like that's the other side of the coin of the plausibility of premise one. Something else that is quite plausible is that we certainly don't have direct control over our beliefs,
Mm-hmm.
insofar as to reuse an example, but I like it a lot. Is it's like if someone tells you with a gun pointed to your head to believe that there's a pink elephant in the room, like you're gonna die. You can't just
Yeah.
choose to believe something else. And yeah, there's a sense in which you have or which you could argue you have indirect control over your beliefs by choosing to apprise yourself of uh, bodies of evidence or not. Right? You can choose to open up the book and read the argument for atheism or theism. If the relevant conversation is God's existence, you can choose to pray and see if there's a religious experience there or not. But even then, I think the same kind of concerns will reappear at that second level of like, what's the ultimate source of your decision to comply or not with that impetus to look at the evidence? Ultimately, it would seem that it's just factors inside you that happened rather than factors that you chose. And so that kind of gets back to Alex O'Connor's argument that I raised to get
Mm-hmm.
Huemer's response to, of like, what ultimately decides what we want to do? We do what we
Sure.
want, but who chose what? Like, we choose to do what we want, but who chose what we wanted at the
Well,
most
that's
fundamental
actually
level?
that goes back to Schopenhauer, who he kind of tried to have it both ways, and Nietzsche criticized him for that. But what Schopenhauer said was, a man can do what he wills, but he cannot choose what he wills. And so that there's like a certain, I mean, like you kind of have to essentialize the human being, or create a unitary identity, but you're basically saying you have like a certain nature or something. And you might make choices and you'll say, yes, that's the choice I wanted to make. But the argument would be, again, to run back the clock, if you presented that person with that choice an infinite number of times, they would always do the exact same thing every single time. And to me, that, on a very basic level, it's very hard for me to see how, if you changed no factors and you presented the same person with the same decision point over and over an infinite number of times, I again, my intuition tells me it would be the same, all things being equal. Like, and that's why it's very difficult to say that, like, there's this kind of arbitrarily governing free will force within you, because it seems to, and this maybe takes us back to Nietzschean territory again. It's not really addressing Huemer's argument, but just, I don't know, kind of grounding it back in that, is that it seems to take out everything about the human being that we really care about when we talk about the free will debate. Because, like, even the free will libertarian, as Huemer points out, he says, well, at least some of the time we make these decisions based on our free will. So you always have to acknowledge nature. You always have to acknowledge nurture. You always have to acknowledge, like, the hungry judge issue, that there are these things going on inside of you. So it's like, yeah, we have free will so long as we take what you are away from your genetics, your upbringing, your circumstances, every factor that's affecting your mood and mind state that day, basically everything that you are. And then you have free will. And it's just as like a rational, as a detached rational mind. That's the sense in which you have free will. And I think it's very hard for me to believe in that version of rationality, at least for my part. I think, and to me, I do believe it's like all of those things that we're talking about are like, they are inseparable from who I am. And that I do feel like my decisions flow out of all of those things. And so, on the other hand, it's like, yeah, when you go to a decision point and you're at like a crossroads, we do have the experience of making choices. That seems undeniable. Of like, but what I would, again, the value of Nietzsche, I think, is that he psychologically tells us that what he thinks is really happening there is that you have like multiple drives representing like hypothetical outcomes, to sort of like that. Again, it's either an imagined future in which multiple timelines could have played out in which you did different things, or you're revisiting the past and you're regretting something or wishing you could have done something differently. It's not clear to me that we're actually free to make the choice in the moment. It seems like that's a concern that we make either retrospectively, or it's like it's like each drive with its ruling thought drawing its consequences within your psyche, and then eventually you go with the representation or the image of like what the optimal future would be. The other aspect of this is that perhaps the reason why we really believe in free will, again, if the real thing that we're trying to get out of it is moral responsibility, a lot of that probably does come from regret and guilt, which again Nietzsche thinks is like the community. That's like the there's something very Freudian about it. It's like the fact that we're civilized and the community, sort of like, the reason why we feel guilt is because that's like a way for your psyche, your conscience has like internalized the morality of society, and it's punishing you for violating the morality of society. That's what's really going on. And then so the basis of that guilt, though, is I should have done something different. Now, and that's very funny because it kind of brings us back to Huemer's argument, right? When you say I should have done something different, I don't necessarily think that implies that you could have. It would in an absolute sense, but really what you're feeling is you're like, I wish it's more of a statement, I wish I hadn't done that, which is not exactly the same thing. It's like, you're living with the guilt and you're like, I don't want to live with this guilt anymore. I wish I hadn't done that. And so then we reason from that in the moment you could have done something different. And that maybe there's like a real reason for that feeling from, like, again, the perspective of like social utility. it might be like absolutely necessary that we feel those feelings of guilt, but that doesn't mean that it is actually pointing to a noumenal or objective truth or something like that. I kind of went all over the place there, but I don't know. I don't know what you think
Oh
about
no, you're fine. You're absolutely fine. Well, Keegan, thank you so much for this conversation. I
it.
appreciate the opportunity to talk with you and to be faced with Nietzsche's thought once again, to grapple with it, because I think it repays the effort of trying to understand what he's saying, because it's not
Thank you.
always clear, but once you break it down, it's worthwhile. So again, thank you for the conversation. I think people will enjoy it. I hope they will, and I'd be keen to see what Michael Huemer thinks about it.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you very much. I hope Michael thinks I did him justice. I'm sure he'll have a problem with it, but and I would just
Sure.
say again to anyone, if your audience is primarily analytical, I think Spinoza is like a great beginning point
Mm,
for like getting into continental philosophy. And if you're interested in Nietzsche, um, I wouldn't go to like Thus Spoke Zarathustra or like the very narrative works that he has. He's got a really great essay called On Truth and Lies in the Non-Moral Sense, which is can be seen as a
mm,
precursor to Wittgenstein. His positivist work in around human all too human, well, it is aphoristic and it jumps all over the place. He does advance arguments, actual arguments, and points that you can kind of follow.
mm.
I would just say there is something interesting there, and if nothing else, if I've provided a window into that world, so much the better. And thank you for giving me that opportunity. I had a great time.